I think these traditions carry on, and they mean a lot to people.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a weekly podcast sharing the stories of a place known as Utah's Dixie, and brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation. Through stories as universal as they are personal, this podcast is dedicated to the memory of legendary family physician Dr. Craig Booth and to defining, preserving, and perpetuating the spirit of Dixie embodied in his life and work.
Hi, I'm Lyman, host of the Not Forgotten podcast. For more than 40 years, I've been writing and publishing with the intent of connecting landscape and story in the American Southwest. I believe the words spoken by a character in a story by Barry Lopez. Everything is held together by stories, he said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. Dr. Craig Booth was a man of stories and compassion. His personal story is one of the many that have made Utah's Dixie what it is, and his compassion is at the heart of that elusive entity we call the Dixie spirit. It's an absolutely beautiful day in Utah's Dixie, right in the middle of December right now, and it couldn't be a more beautiful day out there, and it couldn't be a more awesome experience for me right at this moment to be in the studio with three of my heroes. And I've been looking forward to this because all four of us are going to be able to talk about one of our greatest heroes, and that's Walt Brooks, Coach Walt Brooks. In the studio today, we have Warren Brooks, who is a grandson of Coach Brooks. And he brings all of this kind of full circle because he's currently the principal of Dixie High School. And Dixie High School is at the heart of everything we're talking about today. And when you really stop and think about it, the whole Dixie spirit really, I think, grew out of Dixie High School. And going all the way back to those amazing basketball teams in the 1920s, and then all the basketball and the football legends all through those decades. But it wasn't all sports, but sports was a big part of the whole Dixie spirit. And I remember when I was at Woodward Junior High in the late 1960s, and my heroes were already at Dixie High School, and two of them are here today, Denny Drake and Steve Snow. And Steve, we all know as a beloved son of Dixie who has served as a general authority of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and who was the church historian for many years, an amazing legacy there and calling. And next to him, Denny Drake. Denny was the quarterback of that great 1967 championship team. He and Steve grew up together. They've been friends all their lives. They still spend a lot of time together, golf together, telling stories, and I'm sure those stories get better all the time, Denny.
We get better all the time. The older we get, the better we are.
It's true. Denny was originally an educator and then became a very successful businessman in southern Utah and also a civic leader. Denny has served as mayor of the city of Santa Clara. He served on the council there. County, Denny, what years were you on the county commission?
From 2006 to 2014.
And has done so much in this community. And both Steve and Denny have also gone away to serve as mission leaders. Steve in Southern California and Denny in Houston, Texas. And then Steve grew up under these mulberry trees and then once he was called as a general authority, he went away and traveled all the way around the world and lived in many parts of the world and served there, but is now back. And it's great to have you back, Steve. So I'm talking a lot here. We want to hear from you three, but I think it'd be great to start with Warren. If you could just tell us a little bit about your grandpa Walt and about the Brooks family and how they became part of this whole Dixie story.
Okay, thank you. My grandfather is Walt Brooks. Back in 1856, my great-great-grandfather was just a young boy, 11 years old. They lived in Wells, lived on the Point of Ayr there in Wells, where his father was the keeper of the lighthouse. Well, he was actually born in St. George Wells, oddly enough, and his name was George, and they later heard about the gospel of Jesus Christ and wanted to travel to Salt Lake. So they loaded up, and his sister and his little brother and his dad and mom, they took a boat across with not too much information because we'll keep this a little short, and started across the plains. Along the way, his mother, who was used to the finer things of life, couldn't handle the daily rigor, and she passed away. And then by the time they got to Salt Lake, his father, Samuel Brooks, was really ill, so they took him immediately to a tent to care for him, and they took his sister, which was older, and she went to Ogden to be a house help caretaker. His little brother had a clubfoot, so they put him in a foster care area, and George was 11 years old and alone. And so he said, I didn't know what to do, and he went back to visit with his father, and his father had passed away. So he lived there, and the Perry family kind of adopted him, so he had some place to stay. And then later, a few years later, he was called to go to St. George and to help build and establish St. George, where he became a stonemason. So he came to St. George, and George did, and became a stonemason and worked on the tabernacle and the temple and different places with the stone. Well, George grew up and had a family, and he had a boy named Will Brooks. You've probably seen his book or heard of his book. Uncle Will tells his story. He married Nellie Stevens, who had 6 boys. 2 of them died when they were very young, and the oldest was Walt Brooks. And so Walt began his life in St. George in 1912, in late June in 1912.
So Coach Brooks, as we know him, his grandpa was one of the original settlers here. I remember Carl Brooks talking about George and how the marks from his tool, his chiseling tool, you can actually see them in the tabernacle wall today. And that's an amazing legacy, to be able to walk up to that and see your grandpa, your great-great-grandpa's mark in that stone.
Yeah, his were unique, so we always go look at it. And
what an amazing legacy. So Walt was born into this Dixie story.
Yes, and he grew up here. He loved St. George just all his heart. He went on a mission when he was young, and then when he returned, he married Irene Cox. And then his first job was in Hurricane, Utah, back in, that would be 1936 is when he started in Hurricane. And he worked there for 9 years, and then had an offer to work at, just when Dixie High School and the college were kind of separating a little bit. And so they needed a coach to coach all things. And so they hired him, and he left Hurricane and began at Dixie High School. And that would be in 1944.
Awesome. Well, and that's a little bit before the time of these 2 representatives of his ball teams, but it was an amazing story that began at Dixie. And as I look at Steve and Denny, I think, okay, I don't want to put pressure on you, but you're representing thousands of young men who played for Walt Brooks. And today, We would just love to hear from you some of your memories of the man and stories, and give us a feel of who and what he was, but also how all of that plays into the Dixie spirit that we all love.
You know, if I were to give Walt a defining term, it would be integrity. He was honest, true, loyal to us as members of his team, as he expected us to be loyal to him. And later on we'll get into some stories, but the fact that you felt like you were one of his, and in fact, years later after playing for him, he called us, "This is one of my boys." And I always felt that there was concern for me, and that he coached and taught that same way.
By the time we played in the 60s for him, he had become a bit of a legend. We'd had uncles and brothers play for him, and so, when we were aware that 10 years earlier they had taken the state championship, and so he was a bit of a legend, almost bigger than life, and I think that helped him, a little bit of that mystique he had of, if we just felt he could do no wrong. And he was really, by then, a well-established coach, very well thought of in the state of Utah, and just a bit of a legend. And we were a little bit in awe playing for him.
I think that's probably something that all of us who grew up in St. George felt, because I remember even as a little boy, my dad talking to me about Walt Brooks. He played for him, and it would have been the late 40s, early 50s. And I can remember how Dad talked about Walt Brooks. And by the time I got to high school or junior high and was in a position to see him and be in his presence, I felt like, oh my goodness, this is Walt Brooks. And that it's a generational thing that started in the 30s and was still alive, and people were feeling those same feelings in the 70s.
Yeah, as we developed as young men, a lot of reflection back on our families was Walt was familiar with at least one or two of our brothers or our uncles or our fathers, and kind of expected and applied what they had done to what he thought we could do. And so often it was input from his assistants that changed positions on the team. I remember in my particular case, as a sophomore, I was playing tackle and guard and linebacker, and we played our first JV game in Panaca against their varsity, and Merton Lovell got me to play quarterback. And in playing quarterback over there, they liked what I did, and from that point on, they worked me into that position. But it was input, and he listened to his assistants and included them in decisions and plans. And I'll get in. To me, I got to play for a number of coaches over the years in college and so forth. And I'll talk about a couple of the traits that I felt were nowhere else found. I didn't get them from any other coach. And he was an amazing man.
The two of you grew up together as friends. When did you first start to be friends?
I think it was the fourth grade.
Fourth grade. Yeah, we've been friends for a long time.
Did you play football on the church lawn or on the park lawn, or?
We didn't play. There was no tackle football till you were a ninth grade, 10th grader.
Yeah,
And
10th grade.
10th grade was when we put on our first football uniform. But then we had a great time there behind the old Woodward building where the school district offices are. There was a big field, and there was occasion to pull 5 or 6 cars down on each side, and then we'd have a night football game in the middle. I don't think you could do that today.
We played a lot of touch football, but it wasn't, they didn't have the leagues like they have now with the kids.
When you were younger, you played baseball.
We played baseball, but there wasn't any organized football leagues for kids.
Talk about your Little League baseball a little bit.
Well, we were on the championship team.
Yeah. We played for, the team was Washington County Dairy Association. That's who we played for. We were known as Dairy.
Dairy.
Yeah.
I remember Dairy.
Yeah. We had a lot of fun.
That team, everybody wanted to be on. We had great coaches and great team mates, and we had a ball. And it was something to look forward to go to practice and then to go down there at the Elks field and play baseball on the Little League field.
We had good coaches. They knew baseball, Robert Everett and Skylar Everett. And it was just fun. They taught us how to play.
That's great. So as you entered into junior high and getting closer to the chance to play football, was that something you anticipated or looked forward to?
I certainly looked forward to it. I in my case, I was the oldest in my family. My dad hadn't played, so I was relying on a little bit of my uncles, what they'd tell me about playing. I was really looking forward to football. I was a little apprehensive. I didn't know if I was good enough or if I could play. And I remember the first time Coach Brooks measured me for pads, he said, "Oh, you got a bigger chest than I thought." And he says, "You're going to be good." And just that little word of encouragement really went a long ways. What I learned about playing on a team like that and being led by a good coach really taught me a lot of great life lessons from that experience.
Then he played quarterback, or at least by the time you were in playing varsity, you were quarterback. What position did you play?
I played end. I kind of wanted to be an offensive end, but I was too slow. An offensive end. So they put me in at defensive end. And I loved the position just because on defense you got to hit a lot of people, and I just thought, this has got to be illegal. I mean, this is way too much fun to be able to bang people around like this. And you got a lot of frustrations out as a teenager that you probably wouldn't have had an outlet for otherwise. It was just really fun. I really enjoyed playing defense. Denny led the offense, but I was on the defense.
So you didn't get to catch any passes from Denny?
I caught a touchdown pass from him in Milford, but I think by then they were down to about the fifth string.
Well, I'm glad to have that documented, that there was a pass completed between
But he was
the two of
one
you.
of the best defensive ends you've ever seen. Nobody went around his end, and they knew it. And unfortunately, he got a bad thigh bruise before the state championship game, and he still played the game. But back when we played, I felt like our team every player should have been all-state. We loved each other and we loved playing, and it was just amazing to be a part of that kind of an organization. Even today, we're still best friends, and we have friends that we played football with that we see all the time. When we have our class reunions, it's pretty memorable to be able to get together with each and every one of them, and it's part of the legacy of Dixie and the spirit that comes with that.
Well, I don't want to. What's the word for it? Try to outdo or anything, because we can't even come close. But our class of '73, we celebrated 50 years this past year, and the principal at Dixie invited us to be there, and we won that state championship in '73. But it was like we were all, and I say we, I wasn't on the team. I was off rodeo, and I started playing in JV, but Don Lay kicked me off the team because I kept going to rodeos and I'd come to practice limping. And he said, "Hafen, pick one or the other." And so I picked the one that was less physically abusive, rodeo, and which is true because football, I always said that football, in rodeo, if you get on a bull or a bronc, it's over in 8 seconds. In football, you just keep going back in, play after play. I diverge here, and I apologize, but that in 73, we as a class, we were looking back to you in 67. We were remembering 67 and your state championship, which was something that what's awesome is how the community really converged around all of these things in such a neat way. And I wondered if maybe you could just tell us about that season of 67. And
well, it was an interesting time. It was a small town, there was 5,000 people here then. So, and back then, you'd get a haircut about every week or two. Honestly, it was $1 to get a haircut. And when you'd go in the barbershop, everybody'd want to talk to you about football and the game last week and the game coming up. And you felt almost like a star, and you just because you were on the team, and the whole town got very excited. These were the days when they'd fill the gym, to the ceiling. They'd fill the gym for basketball, and huge crowds at the Sun Bowl for a Friday night football game. That just doesn't happen much anymore because obviously there's a lot more high schools here in the area. But back then, there was one high school, and the whole community followed high school sports. So it was a time that I'd never ever experienced before or since. It was a fun time.
I got to know, where did each of you get your haircut in those days?
Ted Gubler.
I went to Glenn Frisbee.
I actually shined shoes in Neil Adams' barbershop, but when I got my haircut, I went to Ted Gubler.
Glenn rented space for my grandfather in the old E.B. Snow Furniture Company's building. So you always dance with who brung you. So I needed to always go to Glenn. And he gave good haircuts.
And when you talk about the community, I happened to work for a number of years. In fact, in 8th grade, I started working at the roadside grocery, which was a little convenience store on the very west side of St. George. And the owner never closed. There was a half a day on Christmas. Other than that, it was open every day of the year, except when we played the semifinal football game in the state tournament. He closed down, and everybody went to the football game. They loved the Sun Bowl, going up and down the sidelines following that, and a lot of them had played for Walt. And I think that the idea that they could see themselves on that same team and see him in leadership helped to draw them there. And it was really a community spirit.
So that's really saying something if the roadside grocery closed.
Yeah.
That's great. Reminisce a little more about that season, that year. You were both seniors?
We were.
We were.
Yeah, and Walt had gotten an idea that I might be able to play defense too. And so the first game of the season, we played Moapa Valley, and almost invariably, we played Moapa the first game of the season, and if they beat us, then they lost state championship, and if we beat them, then we'd lose a state championship. Well, that year we go down, and I'm playing D-back, and I let 2 passes go for touchdowns, and they ended up beating us. And I never played an ounce of defense from that point on.
I think I got thrown out of that game for getting in a fight. So it wasn't a great inauguration.
Are we documenting here that Elder Snow got thrown out of a football game?
I didn't throw the first punch, but I threw the punch that the ref saw. So the season didn't start off too well.
But it was improving.
Yeah.
But it was a good sign.
We ended up averaging, I don't know if they counted the Moapa game, but we averaged 40 points a game on offense and allowed 6 points on defense for the entire season. So that was, I'm not sure if they counted the Moapa game, but
They must have had a great quarterback and a great defensive end.
Obviously.
Well, it was interesting as we came up through when we were sophomores, Walt had been thrown off a horse and couldn't coach. And that year we got beat by a number of high schools that we would never have been beaten by had Walt been the coach, including
Parowan, Hurricane, Canal,
Milford.
This was our sophomore year.
Sophomore year. And Walt was able to come back and coach the last game of the season, which was against Beaver High School, who went on to win the state championship and was undefeated. And we beat them 26-6. Big fight in the Sun Bowl after the game. But it was interesting how, you compare coaching and what was going on, and he was just an amazing man when it came to getting the best out of you.
Yeah, it was a great motivator.
Yeah.
So as you think about that year, that senior year, what were some of the things that Coach Brooks did, or how did he influence you?
Well, we had training rules, and there was a time to be in bed. I think his preparation for games was so well, but it was every practice. We'd hit the 7-man sled. I don't know if you've ever seen a 7-man sled, but we drove that sled all over the field, and you had to be right on.
Now, give us the location of this. Now, were your practices at the old
college track?
Old college track?
Down below by the Dixie
What are the
Market.
coordinates there for those who have no idea where that was?
That would be at about
Second south.
2nd South and 300 West.
And that's where that original football field and track.
That was where a practice field was.
Yeah, the college played there as early as the 20s, clear back. And then after a year or two after we used it, I think it was converted into housing.
And the where the stadium is at now for Utah Tech became the practice field for Dixie State, and then we practiced below the new high school. And so it moved. But
The Sun Bowl was built in 46, 47. Prior to that, the games were being played over on that field that you just described. And the track was there, and they probably had track meets there.
They did.
They
even
did.
Beyond that, because there was no track at the...
No, that cinder track they used for many years even after they'd moved.
in fact, I'm not sure that they didn't use it all the way through my high school years, the time we were seniors.
Yeah, that's true.
So back to Walt and that year, what do you remember about him and how his influence turned into a state championship that year?
I don't remember him ever really yelling like, some coaches do, but he would just call us together and talk to us. And, everybody, like I say, we felt he was a legend then, and it was really, we just felt privileged to be able to play for him. And obviously he knew the game well. He came up with a series that Denny ran that was very successful. It was hard to defense against, and word had it that he'd come up with this offense during his temple shift down at the temple. So that kind of gave it an extra bit of allure that, this has got to be really good.
Would you call that inspired leadership?
That's the way we looked at it. And it was the B series, and later on, within a couple of years, they were basically running a variation of that all over the nation called the wishbone, and where they'd move the backs up and back, and as a quarterback watching the wishbone work, in fact, Delta High School became a powerhouse running the wishbone formation and playing football with what I considered Walt's principles. And it was really special. But I don't think it was a one-year thing. I believe that the tradition and the belief in Walt started long before we started playing football for him. And so whatever he did and whenever he did it, we believed in it and we followed it. And I think that was his legacy of success for us. The morals of a Southern Utah community he taught. You couldn't swear on the field or you ran a lap. You couldn't. In fact, one of the things he would have gotten in trouble for is you couldn't get a drink of water until he broke practice to let everybody go get a drink of water. Nobody got to get an individual drink. So we learned to persevere in those August practices.
There's one tap, and then the whole field.
And that's part of playing football in Utah's Dixie is that August heat.
Yeah.
2 a day in August.
We were fortunate to have a united staff. I mean, Walt at the head, but you had a seminary teacher. Jim Marshall was an assistant coach, and Mert Level, who was a teacher, and Wally Mathis, who was a teacher, that was the staff. And they believed in Walt's principles and his teachings, and his motivation was interesting. He wanted you to be able to do the best that you could do. And he expected that. You worked harder for him than you did for anybody else. And it was that expectation and his belief in you that made you succeed and be better than what you probably really were.
That's really true. He did say, I remember, he says, you can have a job, you can have a girlfriend, or you can play football, but you can't do all three. You could do two, but you couldn't do all three. So if you play football, you're going to have a job or a girlfriend, not both. So that sounded good, but it didn't work out too well for me. But I had to work.
I worked.
You were both working.
Well, and he accommodated that. Practice Wednesdays was his temple day. Practice was called off early because he was an officiator in the St. George LDS temple, and we'd go home. But I had a job. I worked every night after school and after practice. Practice would be at 3 o'clock. It would be over at 5, and I could be to work at 5:30, and I'd work from 5:30 to 9:30 every day. And I did happen to have, I want to say, a number of girlfriends over the years. So it wasn't limited.
That's an understatement.
No. And as a quarterback, you watch the football game as it's morphed over the years, and the coaches call every play. Walt never called a play for me. He always asked me what I had called, but he never changed the play that I'd called. And he'd always say, that sounds good. And from that point, I felt confident that he felt confidence in me and that we could succeed with those plays. And I got taught by his brother, Carl, what defenses were. In fact, I spent that time moving Carl from Mesquite to Salt Lake during the summer one summer, and we were to talk football and defense. That was what Walt had made the assignment. That was my pay. I got to learn to play football, and I did. And with that came a lot of confidence in what I was doing, knowing his offense. Today, football is more play-oriented. Back then, it was more series-oriented. You ran a play to set up another play, and they all looked the same when you started. And very few people could ever stop his offense, and very few people ever did for years and years. He always had a winning season. He was always one of the top teams in the state, and he never changed the offense from day one till he retired. And it was an amazing thing to watch from the outside. I went on to play for 3 college coaches, and if they could have adapted his philosophy, I think they could have won considerably better than what they did. And it just amazes me to watch all that keeps going.
Let's come back to Warren here for a minute. Warren, as these two have talked about your grandpa, what are thoughts that have come to your mind that you'd like to share?
One thing that came to my mind is back in the later 60s, so probably when you were playing football, I went to see my grandpa. We went over, and he liked to fish. So he took me on a little fishing boat out to Gunlock, and we were fishing, and he said, it's time for lunch. So he pulled his boat off to the west side, the northwest side, and there was a little dry riverbed that came out that had sandy area there. So we get out, and I get in the sand, and I run down the sand, and I saw something shiny. So I picked it up, and it was a little old-timer knife. So I opened it up, and my grandpa said, do you know what to do with that? I said, oh, yeah, watch this. So I started whittling a stick and making a spear. Everything was a spear, you know. He says, well, let me actually show you and teach you something. This is actually a valuable tool. So let's go to the boat and get a whetstone. I didn't know what a whetstone was. So he pulled out his little bar and put a little water on it. He said, now, if it's going to be a useful tool, we need to keep it sharp. So he showed me how to sharpen it. So he let me do it. He just guided me. So I sharpened it up, and he made some adjustments in how I should sharpen it. And I got it, and it was really, really sharp. And I picked up a stick, and it just went through there like melted butter. I thought, this is the greatest thing ever. He said, now, let me teach you something. Everything was a teaching moment. He said, this knife, it is a valuable tool as long as it's sharp. But if it gets dull, you'll cut yourself and you hurt yourself. I'm like, got it. So back then I lived in Blanding, so we went back to Blanding, and boy, I was fantastic at carving spears and arrows. And well, it got dull because I didn't sharpen it. And he did tell me also, if it gets dull, you can hurt yourself. And it's kind of like you. Stay sharp. Always stay sharp so you don't hurt yourself or others around you. Well, that didn't mean a whole lot to me at that point. So I get home, and it got dull, and I was trying to, and I slipped, and I just cut part of my thumb off. And then I remembered that he said, keep your knife sharp, but also keep you sharp by living the teachings that you've been taught by your fathers and your grandfathers, and living your gospel and doing what you should. As long as you're sharp, you won't hurt yourself or hurt others. And as my thumb healed, I thought, well, I'll never let that knife get dull. I better keep myself sharp too. So that was a teaching moment he gave when I was young, when I found a pocket knife, and it's to keep the knife sharp as well as myself by living the gospel of Jesus Christ and doing the things that I needed to do. So that was just one, but I had lots of experience with him because he knew I was the oldest grandson, and he knew I was a character. And when I got the age you were at, I thought I was all it. And when I think back, I thought he was so old, but he was like 68 years old, so getting closer to my age. Now, he took me up to Enterprise to work with him. He had a little fishing house in the garden, had this old tractor and this old metal furrower. It was just so heavy, but they didn't have like hydraulic lifts or anything, so he'd pick it up and bolt it on the tractor. So he gets on the one side, and we back the tractor up, and he lifts his side of the tractor up, on the furrower up, just picks it up to his waist. He said, now you pick your side up and we'll put it on. Well, I thought I was all it, so I go to pick it up, and I couldn't budge it. And he looked at me and says, you know, Warren, this is really heavy. You need to hurry. So I pick it up, and I'm just walking like a collapsed duck, kind of with my knees knocked together, and carried over there, and we put it on, and he bolted it on, and looked at me and says, that wasn't so bad, was it? So he was always keeping me humble and teaching me at the same time that, you know, sometimes you might think you're all it, but you're really not.
That is so great, Warren. And I think those kind of stories, that kind of influence, thousands of young men were the beneficiaries of. as we're talking here, I'm looking at the three of you, and you all three just embody the Dixie spirit in such an amazing way. And I wonder, as we try to define what that is, and it really is something special. And it's not that every place doesn't have its spirit and its greatness, but how would you equate Walt Brooks and your experience with him with what this thing is that we call the Dixie spirit?
Well, maybe I could try. Walt believed in hard work. On the football field, he expected you to work very hard. And yet you got the joy from doing it. He also expected you to serve. You were to perform your duty and let the other person perform his duty, and it worked together as a team. And in the early days of St. George, I think that was what carried the Dixie spirit, was not necessarily just the hard work, but the fact that we would work together. I mean, I think back of my ancestors being called to St. George and living in dugouts and huts, and very shortly thereafter, Brigham Young telling them to build a temple. They're having a hard time eating, and yet they took the time to go do what the Lord had asked them to do and build a temple. And I think that spirit is what Walt used, and his integrity was never in question. I'll give you an example. When we were juniors in high school and playing Delta in the semifinal games in the Sun Bowl, there was a play with about 27 seconds left, well, 27 seconds left to go in the game. We were tied with them, and we had them 100 yards in total offense, which means we would have won. The only way they could beat is if they scored. And they ran a sweep around our side, and the defensive end knocked it loose, and we recovered the ball. And the referee on the sideline gave it to us. The head man came across the field and gave it back to Delta. Well, we still should have tackled the guy. We hit him 3 times, but he ended up scoring, and they beat us in the semifinal game. And it was always a question. And in the summer meetings with the Utah High School Activity Association, Marion Trees, who was the director, asked those officials, did Walt Brooks come on the field? And they said, yes, he did. And Marion Trees said, then you were wrong. And that's the kind of man we had coaching and teaching us and teaching thousands of others here in St. George of what is important. And I think that carries over into everything. It wasn't just the people who played with him, it was the people who knew him. And the integrity that he had was part of that Dixie spirit. If you're given an assignment, you fulfill the assignment, and you help benefit those around you by doing your work.
Yeah, he epitomized, in my mind, the Dixie spirit. He was a great influence on a lot of young people. He was just a really good man. Just everyone knew he was a good man, and he had a great reputation. He didn't tolerate poor losers. If we got beat, then he wanted us to man up and accept it and do better the next time. I was just reminiscing about, back then we didn't stay overnight anywhere because they were just day trips to Milford. That was about as far as we went, was Milford. But when we went to the state tournament, or for this final, we went to University of Utah. We played there at Rice Stadium, and we stayed in Salt Lake, which was a big deal. We stayed overnight. And he was kind of a traditionalist because he wanted us to stay in the same hotel that they'd stayed in 1957. And this was a real dive. The new the Grandview Hotel or something. I mean, there was literally cords with light bulbs hanging, bare light bulbs. It was, and then, they had us, 2 of us in a bed, I mean, they could never get away with this stuff now, but we had a great time, but we left on Thanksgiving Day after like at 1:00, and we had a Thanksgiving dinner at a Chinese restaurant across the street from this hotel, and everybody got sick. It was called the King Joy, and we called it. Everybody was sick the next day, and we called it the King Joy Blues, and it was tough getting through the championship game because we had stomach issues, bad.
All of us down here with our ears glued to the radio didn't have any idea that you were going through all that.
We got into the halftime, and there wasn't probably 10 players in listening to Walt's halftime speech. Everybody else.
The restroom. On the way home, the bus driver would stop at every little town every 50 miles and go all up and down Main Street looking for restrooms to drop football players off at. It was a long trip home.
I didn't know that. Did you know that, Warren? We've got a real scoop here from the state championship.
We had the censored version.
Well, we just knew that they won it, and we were champions, and we didn't know what it took to do that. Like I said earlier, the two of you are sharing what thousands of other young men relate to perfectly. And we know that there could be 1,000 of these stories told. We're trying to capture the essence of Coach Brooks in an hour-long podcast here, but it's so great what you're sharing and how you're sharing it. It strikes me that we've talked this whole time and neither one of you have mentioned Cedar.
And we won't. But I do want to tell one story, too. Talking about the respect of the community with Coach Brooks is when it came time for his retirement. Coach had taught all of his life. He was a dedicated educator. As a dedicated educator, he had not accumulated a whole lot of money. And it was suggested that the community come together and buy him a car. And I've never felt a part of something so worthwhile as being able to contribute some money to the purchase of a car. And for his retirement, we presented him with a Ford Fairlane, and you should have seen his face. He was just beaming, and it was a community thing. It was people within the community recognizing his contribution to the community and participating in giving him something that we thought was worthwhile. And again, that comes back to the Dixie spirit that you were talking about.
I thought it was a real fitting tribute for someone who given so much and so much time. You figure up the time that these coaches back then and even now put in, they're making less than $1 an hour. I mean, it was just a lot of time that was given that was not compensated for. And so I thought this act by the community was a great tribute to close out his coaching career.
I look back over at Warren here and I think, here we are a 3 generations later, and your principal at Dixie High, and how things have changed so much. And yet those students at Dixie High are blessed to have you as the leader of that school. You bring that same spirit and that same ethic and that same just the aura of your grandpa to Dixie High today, and you're teaching the same principles that he taught. How do you feel about that, Warren, and where we are today in our community?
Well, our community is definitely different, but I'll have to tell you, I'm the luckiest person on this planet, because every morning when I drive to school and the sun's coming up, and I drive down Bluff Street, then I head on 700 South, and I pass Walt Brooks Stadium, I think, wow, I'm so lucky to go to school, to be around 1,200, 1,300 students every day that most of them want to be there. That we live in this great area. It's absolutely beautiful, and I see why it is because of people that went before me who worked so hard, both Denny and Steve, who did so much for not only the football team and the basketball team, but the community, the area, the religious aspects, just all that's involved in the community. And I think, how lucky am I to be able to basically go here and perhaps end my career at such a wonderful place, Dixie High School and Walt Brooks Stadium. And just, even though the buildings have changed and things are different, but it's still in the same location. And as we're working on, we're still updating new things to keep it so we can keep using it for years and years and years. But it's amazing, and I get to feel that spirit every day when I walk down the halls and just get to talk to the students, to visit with them, to see their interactions. And we do live in a beautiful world and a beautiful place, and I'm sure glad I'm here.
When I get a chance to go to Dixie High School, I'll try to take a grandchild with me. I'll take them right to the trophy case and show them that old trophy and tell them these stories. And, they're pretty bored, but it brings back a lot of nice memories to me. So I think these traditions carry on, and they mean a lot to people. And so I'm grateful to have been part of that.
You have to think that those trophy cases and the way that you've captured that history, Warren, at Dixie High School, that has to be meaningful to kids nowadays. And they're there with 1,200 other students. We were there. I was there with, I think, 180 in my class, and I don't know, 155 back then. And now it's just one high school out of how many in the county now? 6 high schools in the county.
Well, 7 counting the Enterprise. But...
Yeah. But we can all point back to Dixie High School because that's where all of this started. And it is so fitting that the football stadium is named for your grandpa. And our podcast is part of the Doc Booth Foundation. And as I think of Greg and Maureen Booth and the role they played in that stadium becoming what it is, it's just great to think how we had something very special 50, 60 years ago, but we still have something very special, and that spirit continues. And as I talk to folks who have moved here, they want to know more about that spirit. They feel something here. They know there's something here. And I think that what the three of you have shared today will be meaningful to them as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been great to be with you.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The breath.